On the night of my 72nd birthday, I heard knocking at the gate of my mansion. It was Brian, my son, and Vanessa, the same woman who called me dead weight and kicked me out of her house 12 years ago. "We're family," she said, holding a cheap cake and forcing a smile I never saw back when I was sleeping in a rundown motel with $800 in my pocket. You know when someone's so bold that you start to wonder if they're actually serious? My reaction? Well, no one saw it coming. Stick around to the end, I promise it's going to surprise you. But before we go on, help us grow by subscribing to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. My name is Jerry Monroe. I'm 72 years old, and I spent 30 years of my life doing maintenance work in the public schools of Springfield, Missouri. After my wife Claire passed away from cancer, I tried to reconnect with Brian. He said I could stay with them for a while, just until I got back on my feet. The house was small, but it had enough love for 3 generations, or at least that's what I believed. The problem wasn't the square footage. It was Vanessa, who treated me like I was an intruder pretending to be her father-in-law. I was never the kind to impose. I always believed that family is built on patience and mutual respect. She started slow. You know how it goes. Little comments about how I left the towel in the bathroom, how my breakfast got in the way of the kids' morning routine. Vanessa had this gift for turning politeness into discomfort. Every good morning from her felt like a silent accusation. Brian pretended not to notice, glued to his phone or the TV whenever things got tense. I've been through a lot in life, but I never thought I'd feel so out of place in my own son's home. Emotional neglect hurts more than any physical wound. Have you ever felt the chill of a house that's supposed to be warm? The grandkids, Haley and Max, were the only light in that home. They'd run into my arms after school, always wanting to hear stories about the days I fixed broken desks and loose chalkboards. Vanessa hated it. I could see it in her eyes. One afternoon, I caught her whispering something to Haley, and after that, the girl stopped hugging me. That's when it hit me. She didn't just want me out of the house. She wanted me erased from their lives completely. It was a silent war, and I didn't even know I was the target. But then came the part that changed everything. Things started escalating in ways you don't even notice at first. Vanessa began talking about reorganizing the space. My favorite armchair ended up in the basement because it didn't match the decor. My meds, which I used to keep on the kitchen table, suddenly got in the way during meals. She made a point of buying a tiny organizer and stuffed it in a drawer across the room, like my age was some kind of inconvenience that needed to be hidden. You know that moment when you realize you're being treated like an old piece of furniture nobody has the guts to throw out? Sometimes a child's ingratitude comes disguised as practicality and organization. Brian just nodded along like always. The worst part was how they talked about money right in front of me. Vanessa would raise her voice about the electric bills, about how one more person made a difference in the household budget. She'd count the eggs in the fridge, measure how much milk I used in my coffee. One time, she even asked if I could contribute more to the expenses, even though my retirement barely covered my own basic needs. I offered to help with small repairs around the house. After all, that's what I knew how to do. She said it wasn't necessary, but then turned around and complained whenever something broke. It felt like living in a constant emotional overdraft. Have you ever felt like a burden in the life of someone who's supposed to love you? Then came the final blow. One afternoon, Vanessa called me in for a serious talk in the living room. She said I was messing up the family's routine, that the kids needed space to grow, that the mourning period was over and it was time for me to move on. Brian was there staring at the floor, hands in his pockets. He didn't say a single word. She handed me a piece of paper with addresses of cheap motels in town. "This will be better for everyone, Jerry," she said, like she was doing me a favor. I packed my backpack with the few things I still had. She walked me to the door. "Good luck," she said, without even looking me in the eye. The South Side Budget Inn wasn't exactly what you'd call home. The sheets reeked of cheap disinfectant mixed with stale cigarette smoke from past guests. The wallpaper was peeling at the edges, and the air conditioner groaned like a haunted soul. $847 was all I had in the world, not counting the loose change in my jeans pocket. Rebuilding after being abandoned always starts from absolute zero, and I was deep at the bottom. You know that feeling when you've fallen so far that the only way to look is up? That's exactly how I felt in those first few days. I spent my first morning sitting out in the gravel parking lot on a white plastic chair the manager let me borrow. I'd just sit there staring into the void, watching the cars fly by on the highway, each one headed somewhere. I wasn't headed anywhere. No plan, no direction. Just time. Way too much time to think about how everything went wrong. The loneliness was heavier than the Missouri heat. Some days I'd sit there from sunrise to sunset, just watching other people live their lives. It felt like I was in the audience of a movie I didn't even have a role in. I bought a small coffee at a nearby gas station and picked up a used newspaper someone had left on a table. I started circling job ads with a pen that barely worked. There wasn't much to choose from when you're over 60 with a janitor's resume. I dropped off my info at the Garden Valley Center, a supermarket that sometimes hired older baggers. The manager barely glanced at my paper, said they weren't hiring. I walked out with that bitter taste in my mouth, the taste of rejection. I headed back to the motel walking slow, counting the cracks in the pavement just to avoid thinking. The days dragged on, all the same. Morning coffee in the parking lot, quick showers to save hot water, gas station sandwich for lunch. My money was vanishing faster than I expected. A motel's no place for someone trying to save. I kept calculating how many more nights I could afford before I had no idea what to do. I tried a few more places asking for work, but the answer was always the same. Nobody wants to hire a man my age starting from scratch. It was like I'd become invisible to the world. Then one Thursday, a Thursday just like any other, everything started to change. That Wednesday morning, I was sipping my coffee in the parking lot when I saw a plumber unloading heavy cement bags from his truck. The man was dripping with sweat under the blazing sun. I walked over and asked if he needed a hand. He looked at me, a bit suspicious. I mean, an old guy from a motel offering help doesn't exactly scream reliable. "I'll give you $10 if you help me unload all this," he said, pointing to the pile in the truck. I didn't even blink. I offered my arms in exchange for a $10 bill that felt like gold in that moment. It was straight up hard labor, but there was dignity in it. We carried bag after bag to the site. My back complained, but I didn't stop. When we finished, he handed me the $10 and left without much small talk. I just stood there, staring at the construction materials. Broken stones tossed around, leftover bricks, bits of mortar. I don't know what came over me in that moment, but I started gathering the pieces, fitting them together almost automatically. It just felt natural, you know, like my hands knew what to do even when my mind didn't. That day, I built my first little wall out of broken stones. I used discarded tiles and expired cement left over from the job site to start my first projects. I didn't have my own tools, so I'd borrow a hammer here, a level there, always asking politely. I carried everything in a makeshift cart, just some old boards on top of bicycle wheels I found at a junkyard. With every little path I finished, I noticed there was something different about the way I fit the pieces together. People would stop and watch, saying they'd never seen that kind of finish before. I've always believed a man's hands can transform what others throw away. Have you ever noticed how broken things sometimes fit together better than perfect ones? My first real customer came through Miss Martha, an older lady who saw my work on her neighbor's sidewalk. She wanted a little decorative corner in her garden, using leftover materials from a home renovation. I offered to do it for $50, a price that seems ridiculous now, but back then, it meant 5 days of meals. I poured in twice the care, fitting each piece like it was part of a puzzle. Martha was so impressed she snapped a few pictures with her phone. She said she'd never seen anything like it, that it looked more like art than landscaping. I had no idea those photos would change my life. That's how the word of mouth started, neighbor to neighbor. It was Martha who posted my work on Springfield's local Instagram page. She tagged it as junkyard art and sustainable landscaping. Within 2 days, my motel phone started ringing. 3 people asked for quotes, then 5 more, then 10. I barely knew how to use social media, but I could tell something special was happening. Orders started coming in like crazy, people wanting gardens, decorative walls, ornamental walkways. I had more work lined up than I could have imagined. Never thought my late-life comeback would start with a few Instagram photos. Life throws those curveballs you only understand in hindsight. But then came my first big obstacle. In the middle of a project, a city inspector showed up and said I was operating without a license. A $300 fine, nearly half of everything I'd managed to save. The guy was polite, but firm. Either I registered my business or stopped working. I spent 2 days stewing over it, wondering if it was worth it. $300 was a lot for someone barely affording a motel room. But it was also proof that my work was being taken seriously. No one finds you unless you're making waves. That's when I decided it was time to stop improvising and start building something real. I used the last bit of money I had stashed away and set out to register the business. I picked the name Monroe Stoneworks because it sounded professional. I didn't even fully understand what it meant to start an LLC, but I learned the hard way. Documents, fees, licenses, everything cost money I barely had. The lady at the notary office was patient, explaining every paper I had to sign. It felt like I was making something official, a dream I didn't even know I had. Walking out of there with my registered LLC gave me a strange feeling, fear and pride all at once. At 62 years old, I had become a business owner. With the business officially set up, I started operating in a more organized way. I made a basic pricing sheet on the computer at the internet cafe, created a materials list, and set fair prices. The orders kept coming in, now even more regularly. One client recommended me to her sister, who told her brother-in-law, who passed my name to his boss. It became a network that spread on its own, powered by the quality of my work. Every element I placed was like handing out a business card. I've never been one to push my way in anywhere. Rebuilding after being cast aside doesn't happen overnight. It rises, brick by brick. The projects kept getting bigger and more complex. I started designing full gardens, not just small decorative corners. A local company hired me to do the landscaping for their parking lot. 200 square meters of Portuguese stonework made with recycled materials. It was the first job that paid me over $1,000. I remember counting the bills 3 times before I believed it. I was finally moving out of the motel for the first time since I'd gotten there. I rented a small but clean apartment downtown. It was simple, but it was mine. It had a table, a bed, and a window that looked out onto the main street. That was luxury enough for someone who had spent months between 4 stinking walls. At 65, I landed the project that changed everything. The city opened a bid to redo the paving at Memorial Park, the central park everyone in town passed through. It was a big, visible job that everyone would see. I competed with larger companies, but my quote was the most affordable, and my portfolio stood out. I won the contract. It took 3 months of hard work, but when I finished, the results were flawless. Every trail, every flower bed, every bench was perfect. The mayor himself came out for the ribbon cutting. My name made the local newspaper. Jerry Monroe turns Memorial Park into a work of art. I clipped the article and saved it. It was proof I'd made it somewhere I never dreamed possible. Opportunities multiplied after Memorial Park. Companies from other cities started calling me. I landscaped a hotel garden in Kansas City, a school courtyard in Columbia. My company became a reference in recycled material landscaping throughout Missouri. I hired 2 assistants, bought professional tools, and rented a small warehouse for materials. It was surreal to see how far things had come from those broken bits I started with. My schedule stayed packed, sometimes even with a wait list. Who would have thought a man kicked out of his house would become a sought-after entrepreneur? I started saving with one clear goal in mind. I wanted to buy my own home, something that was truly mine. Not just any house. I wanted one with history, with personality. I searched for months until I found the perfect property, a 1911 mansion in the Brookline Station neighborhood. It was known as Oakwood House and had been abandoned for years. The family who inherited it couldn't afford to maintain it, and they were selling at a price that, while high for me, was fair for what it offered. 3 stories, a big yard, a solid structure that just needed work. The irony? It was less than 2 kilometers from the house where Vanessa kicked me out. At 70, I made an offer on the historic property. The price was steep, almost everything I'd saved over years of hard work. But it was more than just a purchase. It was a symbol. I was buying back my dignity, my place in the world. The negotiation took weeks, but in the end it went through. The day I got the keys, I stood at the gate for the longest time, just staring. It was mine. No one could take it from me. No one could call me dead weight. There was a small plaque at the entrance that said Monroe Residence. I had a new one made. Oakwood House, Esther 1911. Tradition and renewal, all in one place. I spent the following year restoring every inch of the mansion. I used the same techniques I'd developed over the years, repurposing discarded materials, creating beauty where there was once neglect. The garden became my personal masterpiece. Paths winding through flower beds, benches sculpted from old stone blocks, a fountain built with leftover marble. Every detail had my mark, my way of turning the broken into something beautiful. Neighbors stopped by to compliment the work. Some even asked for quotes for their own yards. The business had its own permanent showroom now. And the best part? It was just a few blocks from where I was once called a burden. At 71, the house was complete. 3 restored stories, a flawless garden, and a solid structure that could last another 100 years. It was more than a house. It was physical proof that my life had come full circle. Every night, before bed, I'd walk through the rooms just to remind myself that all of it was mine. Paid for with my effort, built with my hands, earned through my persistence. No one could ever take away the place I belonged to again, because now I belonged to a place I had built for myself. On the morning of my 72nd birthday, I was watering the orchids in the garden when I heard knocking at the gate. Through the wrought iron bars, I saw Brian standing next to Vanessa. She held a store-bought cake on a cardboard tray, and he was carrying cheap flowers wrapped in plastic. They were both smiling way too much, with that rehearsed look of someone who'd practiced their lines in the mirror. For 12 years, not a single phone call, not a birthday card, not one word. And now they showed up at my doorstep like nothing had happened. Family betrayal has a habit of showing up just when you no longer need it. "Happy birthday, Dad," Brian shouted from the gate. The word dad sounded foreign in his mouth, like a language he hadn't spoken in years. Vanessa waved with fake enthusiasm, wobbling the cake in the air. "Jerry, we've missed you. The house looks amazing." A flat-out lie. She couldn't even see the property clearly from where she stood. I walked slowly to the gate, watching them both. 12 years had changed more than I expected. Brian had gray hair at his temples and deep lines around his eyes. Vanessa wore heavy makeup to cover the marks of time. It was them, no doubt, but different. Like time had collected its toll on every lie they ever told. "The grandkids talk about you all the time," Vanessa said, using that sweet voice I knew too well. "Haley and Max are always asking about Grandpa Jerry. We were hoping for a fresh start, you know. Leave the past behind. A fresh start. As if 12 years of abandonment were just a minor misunderstanding you could erase with a grocery store cake." I glanced at their car parked on the street. Through the rear window, I saw 2 small silhouettes in the back seat. Haley had to be around 16 by now, Max maybe 14. They'd grown, but their eyes were the same. Curious, bright, innocent. I opened the gate and invited them in. Not out of politeness, not out of forgiveness. I just wanted them to see with their own eyes what I'd built. I left the parents in the front yard and walked to the car to greet my grandkids. Haley got out first, a beautiful girl with the same smile Claire used to have. Max came running after her, taller than the last time I saw him. "Grandpa Jerry!" he yelled, hugging me tight. It was the first time in 12 years someone had called me Grandpa. For a second, I almost forgot all the hurt I'd carried for so long. While the kids explored the garden, I returned to where Brian and Vanessa stood waiting. They were looking around with a mix of barely hidden envy and genuine surprise. The restored mansion, the flawless landscaping, the natural stonework, everything screamed success and good taste. "Wow, Dad, this place is incredible," Brian said, touching one of the columns on the porch. Vanessa nodded along, but she couldn't hide that look of someone doing math in their head. How many zeros was this place worth? Brian had called me Dad for the first time in 12 years. I didn't respond. I showed them every corner of the property. The studio where I designed my projects, the workshop full of professional tools, the trophy room with my awards. Vanessa pretended to be interested, but with each room we entered, her smile got tighter. Brian kept asking questions about the business, the clients, how long it took to build all of this. I answered politely, but with no warmth. They were like tourists in a museum, admiring from the outside without understanding the true value of each piece. It was like they were seeing the finished picture, but never cared to know the story behind the brushstrokes. In the main room, I stopped in front of the wall where I kept my most meaningful achievements. Diplomas, certificates, photos with public officials, framed newspaper articles. I pulled out a yellowed clipping from the Springfield Gazette. dated 6 years ago, and showed it to them. The headline read, "From Rejected to Respected, Jerry Monroe Turns Abandonment into Urban Landscaping Success." I read the first 2 lines out loud. Jerry Monroe, 66, was kicked out of his own son's house 6 years ago. Today, he's the most respected landscaper in Greene County. I paused for 3 seconds, locking eyes with each of them. Then I folded the article slowly. The rest of the piece, well, maybe it's best if you read it with someone unbiased. Vanessa went pale. Brian swallowed hard, eyes fixed on the floor like he used to do as a kid. The room fell silent. Only the sound of the kids laughing in the garden could be heard. They had come expecting to find the same defeated man they threw out years ago. Instead, they found someone who turned rejection into fuel for success. That newspaper wasn't the only proof I had, just one of many, that I didn't just survive without them. I thrived. And now they stood in my house hoping to reinsert themselves into a life they had chosen to leave behind. "Jerry, Vanessa began, but I raised my hand for silence. This wasn't the time for her to speak. There were other things they needed to see first. I took them to the library, where I kept contracts from major projects and letters of recommendation, and the document I was most proud of, the deed to the mansion, registered in my name. "This property was bought with money I earned honestly," I said, running my finger over my name on the letterhead. "Every brick was paid for with the sweat of someone you once called dead weight." They didn't respond. There was nothing they could say. We returned to the garden, where Haley was snapping photos of the flowers and Max was playing with the koi in the pond. Seeing my grandkids there, happy and at ease, stirred something in me I didn't expect. They were innocent in all of this, paying the price for a conflict they never started, but their parents had a lot to answer for. Vanessa approached me with that same manipulative charm she always used. "Jerry, we know we messed up, but that was a long time ago. The kids need their grandfather." Funny how her tune changed when she saw the size of my bank account. Back when I lived in a motel, those kids didn't need me. Brian tried a different angle. "Dad, I know I hurt you. I should have stood up for you back then. But I was in a tough spot, caught between you and my wife. You get that, right? A tough spot." That was his excuse for standing there in silence while they threw me out. I looked at him for a long time, remembering the boy I used to take fishing on Sundays. The man sitting in front of me was the grown-up version of that boy, but without courage, without backbone. It was like looking at a faded photograph of someone you once knew. We walked over to the outdoor kitchen area, where a large solid wood table I had personally restored stood under a pergola. The 4 of us sat down, Brian, Vanessa, me, and the ghost of all the years we lost. The kids kept playing, unaware of the thick tension that hung over the adults. "So," Vanessa said, forcing a smile, "how about we plan a family lunch next weekend?" She spoke as if we'd just seen each other last week, as if there wasn't a chasm of more than a decade between us, as if I'd forget everything just because she brought a cheap cake and a few sweet-sounding words. I stayed quiet for a few minutes, watching my grandkids. Haley had inherited Claire's curiosity. She was inspecting every plant in the garden. Max was more reserved, but I could tell he admired the structures I'd built. They were the only good thing left from this broken family. They deserved to have a grandfather in their lives, deserved to hear their family's stories. But their parents needed to learn that some bridges, once burned, can't be rebuilt with good intentions alone. Some wounds leave permanent scars, and I was just about to make that very clear. I got up from the table and walked over to the desk in my office. I took out a letter I kept in a special drawer, an envelope yellowed with time, but with words that were still crystal clear. I returned to the table where they sat waiting and placed the paper in front of Vanessa. It was the letter she wrote to me years ago, the day after they kicked me out. "Read it out loud," I said, pointing at the paper. She looked at it like it was a venomous snake. "Jerry, that was a long time ago." She began to protest, but I slammed my fist on the table. "Read it." My voice came out firmer than I expected. It was the first time in years I'd used that tone with her. Vanessa picked up the letter with trembling hands. She started reading in a low voice, but I asked her to speak up. "Jerry, you no longer fit in here. Brian and I have decided it's best for everyone if you find somewhere else to stay. Don't take it personally, but your presence is disrupting our family." She paused and looked at me, her eyes starting to water. "Keep going. I said. We trust you'll understand our decision. We wish you luck in your new life. With love, Vanessa. The silence that followed was deafening. Brian stared down at his shoes like they were the most fascinating thing in the world. Haley and Max had stopped exploring the garden and were now watching from the porch, clearly sensing something serious was happening. Vanessa said she always believed in me, I said, taking the letter back and folding it carefully. That she only wanted the best for the kids. I looked her straight in the eyes. Funny how memory plays tricks on us, doesn't it? She tried to speak, but I held up my hand again. Back then there was no room for me in your lives. And now, suddenly, there's space? I walked over to the window, looking out at the garden where my grandkids stood watching, quiet. You know what the difference is between back then and now, Vanessa? I turned to face her. Back then I needed you, but there was no place for me. Today you're the ones knocking on my door. Brian tried to step in. Dad, you know it was a tough time for all of us. It wasn't personal, it was just... I let out a dry laugh. Not personal? I grabbed another paper from the desk, an old bank statement. I had $847 when you kicked me out, and today, I held up the deed to the mansion. Today I own this property, free and clear. Vanessa's eyes widened at the sight of the official document. And you know how I did that, Brian? By ignoring the hardship and pushing forward. Haley walked over slowly, Max right behind her. She had a puzzled look on her face. Is it true? You really asked Grandpa to leave? She asked, glancing between me and her parents. Max frowned, trying to make sense of it all. But you guys always said Grandpa didn't want to see us. Brian and Vanessa exchanged a panicked look. Kids, things were complicated, Brian began. Complicated how? Haley cut in, with that no-nonsense teenage tone that doesn't tolerate vague answers. Max crossed his arms. This doesn't feel right. Why didn't you ever tell us the truth? It wasn't an accusation. It was honest confusion. They were trying to make sense of how two totally different versions of the same story could exist. I turned back to Brian and Vanessa. Now I'm going to make the rules clear, I said, with the same firmness I used when negotiating major contracts. Haley and Max are my grandchildren. They can come here whenever they want. Weekends, holidays, school breaks. This property belongs to them too. I paused to take a deep breath. But you two, I pointed at Brian and Vanessa. You are not welcome here, not after what you did. Vanessa's face flushed with anger. Brian looked at me like I had just slapped him. Haley and Max sat in silence, watching, trying to grasp the weight of what was being decided. But I wasn't done. I had waited years to have this conversation. If you want the kids to have a relationship with me, the rule is simple, I continued. I can take them out for lunch, to the movies, fishing. I'll pick them up from your house and drop them off at the end of the day, but only them. I grabbed a pen and paper from the table. I'm writing down my phone number. When you decide your kids deserve to know their grandfather, you can call me. I wrote the number carefully and slid the paper across the table. Let me be clear. This is the only kind of contact I'll accept. No exceptions. Vanessa grabbed the paper and crumpled it in her fist. You can't do this, she said, voice shaking with anger. I can, and I am, I replied, keeping my calm. I decide who enters my home and who doesn't. I stepped closer to Vanessa and spoke just low enough for her to hear. Just returning the favor. She started to say something, but I had already turned to Brian. And you, my son? The word tasted bitter in my mouth. You stood there and let your wife humiliate me without saying a word. So now you'll stay quiet as I choose not to welcome you into my home. Brian opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Max broke the tense silence. Dad, did you really do that? His voice was quiet, tinged with disappointment. Haley slowly shook her head. That explains a lot. Why you always change the subject when we asked about family? She looked at Vanessa. Mom, this isn't right. It was the disappointment of kids realizing they lost something important because of the decisions adults made. Brian tried to speak, but no words came. How do you explain to your own children that you abandoned your father? Vanessa stood up from the table, her face showing pure defeat. You're going to regret this, Jerry. Max let out a long sigh. At least now we know the truth. Vanessa had no response to the quiet maturity of her own children. Brian followed her but paused halfway to the gate. For a brief second, I saw the boy I raised, the son who once loved me. But it was too late. Some bridges once burned can't be rebuilt. He knew that. I knew that. After they left, I stayed in the garden with Haley and Max. The silence was heavy, but not uncomfortable. Haley finally asked, "Grandpa, what was it like living alone after all that?" I answered honestly, without dramatizing. They listened quietly, asking thoughtful questions, trying to understand. When it was time to take them home, Haley asked, "We really can come visit? For real?" I promised her that whenever they wanted to see me, I'd be here. And for the first time in years, I felt like I'd made a decision that truly brought me peace. Today, a few months after that confrontation in the garden, Max works with me at the company on weekends. He's a natural when it comes to landscaping. His hands just know where each stone should go. Haley wants to study landscape architecture in college. She says she plans to specialize in urban sustainability, using discarded materials to create beautiful spaces. They come over every other week, just like we agreed. They've never missed a visit, never made up a lame excuse. Their word means more to me than any signed contract. Vanessa never showed up again. No calls, no messages, not even a forgotten card in the mailbox. It's like she erased me from her life a second time. Only this time, the choice was mine. Brian sends texts on special occasions. Birthdays, Father's Day, Christmas. Short, polite messages with no emotion. "Happy birthday, Dad. Hope you're doing well." I always reply the same way, just one line. "Thank you," or "appreciate it." It's not cruelty or anger. It's simply the exact measure of what I have left to give. The mansion became the gathering place for the family that truly matters. Max has a bed in the back room. Haley prefers the pull-out couch in the library. Sometimes they bring friends, young people impressed by the story behind the restored property. "Your grandpa built this by himself?" they ask, with that pure kind of respect only the very young express without shame. Max tells the story with pride, never skipping the hard parts. He started from scratch at 60, he says, after they kicked him out. There's no bitterness in his voice, just the facts. "My business has grown beyond what I ever dreamed. I now have 6 full-time employees, 3 trucks, and contracts spread across 4 counties. The phone rings every week with new projects, city contracts, private companies, high-end homes. Last week I got an offer to design the landscaping for a shopping center in Kansas City. The payment would be enough to buy 2 more properties like this one. But I don't need 2 homes. I just need one. That's truly mine, where I choose who walks through the door. The money now is just a result, not the goal. Sometimes working in the garden on a Saturday afternoon, I think back to that first little wall I built after unloading cement. It was rough, uneven, more instinct than technique, but it was mine. Every stone represented a small victory over abandonment, proof that I could still create something useful and beautiful. Today, I look at this entire property, the elaborate gardens, the winding paths, and I know it all started with that crooked little wall. It was paved with the stones they threw away, each one chosen from the rubble of rejection. Each one reminds me, being rejected didn't break me, it built me. Jerry Monroe died in that motel on his first night alone. The man who survived was stronger, wiser, more careful with who he lets in. Someone who learned the difference between blood family and chosen family. Max and Haley chose to truly know me. They chose to be part of my rebuilt life. Brian and Vanessa chose comfort in lies and the convenience of forgetting. Everyone reaps what they sow. Everyone carries the weight of their own choices. I laid the foundation of a new life stone by stone, and now I get to enjoy the peace of someone who knows exactly where he belongs. This house is my victory, my legacy, my quiet proof that starting over is always possible. Now I'm curious about you, the one who heard my story. What would you have done in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Leave a comment down below, and don't forget to subscribe. And while you're at it, I'm leaving one of the channel's favorite stories right here on the end screen. It's one that's guaranteed to surprise you. Thanks for watching.